Hi and welcome to Climate Economics with me, your host, Arvid Viana. And today I'm trying a new format, a best of episode combining some of the best of my earlier episodes regarding air pollution. Because air pollution remains a major public health issue. But instead of a single narrative, you'll hear comparative analysis of how the world's two most populous countries have tackled this problem. And first, we'll tackle the global health and exposure context, and then the institutional mechanics that delivered reductions. Because in China, central standards and monitoring were tied to performance incentives for local leaders. So a classic command and control with enforcement capacity. Whereas in India, there's a more decentralized system, and that allowed the state of Gujarat to pilot a cap and trade program for dealing with air pollution. And as we will see, I think the evidence from Gujarat also shows why economists generally prefer a market program like a cap and trade program, because it's a very good way to reduce emissions in the most cost effective way. So we'll have a good deep dive on how that works in the later part of this episode. So to start off, let's hear some global estimates of the impact of air pollution from Christa Hasenkopf, director of the Clean Air Institute at the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago.
Yeah, globally, we estimate with research we've done at EPIC that currently people are losing about 2 years of life expectancy due to air pollution. And really just one specific type of air pollution, PM 2.5, which is essentially smoke. And that's more than HIV, AIDS, malaria combined. And so it's actually estimated by the Global Burden of Disease to have air pollution is estimated to have the largest impact in terms of mortality and morbidity combined on a negative impact on public health, which is, I think, astounding. And then, depending where you look across the world, it can be the number one driver of mortality, especially in countries in Asia and Africa. And then to your question of like how essentially, I think we all know it doesn't feel good to breathe in pollution, and we know it doesn't feel good on our lungs, and it can cause respiratory issues and long-term things like lung cancer. But something that's a little bit harder to realize without actually having research is that essentially air pollution, especially PM 2.5 particles, these very tiny particles, you breathe them in, they get throughout your entire body, and every single organ can be affected, but it can cause heart attacks, strokes, COPD, and really it exacerbates any other issue in your body as well.
So now let's move from the global picture to a national response. We start in China, where public monitoring and policy attention made air quality a priority from 2010 onward. But let's start with a story of a major event that happened in 2013 regarding the US State Department's embassy in Beijing and what that created in terms of awareness around air pollution.
What happened in the Beijing case in particular was whoever at the State Department had programmed the information that went out to Twitter at the time on a automatic basis. They never expected the air pollution to get above a certain level, so they kind of had a jokey tag for the pollution levels when it got above this apocalyptic level, what it was called in the media. It was like beyond index, and I had a very inflammatory phrase associated with it, and that made headlines, and I think that really got people's attention.
So this event, together with some other ones, led to China declaring a war on air pollution in 2014 and leading to a lot of government decisions related to reducing air pollution. And so the results were quite striking because there was a huge reduction in air pollution. Let's hear from Christa.
It's been stunning, about 40% reduction in the past 10-ish years, which when we compare that to, say, for example, the US's progression, that's been much, much faster, and shows what can happen. In terms of how they did it, to me, I mean, it's a perfect example of air pollution. We know how, like, technically, we all do know how to solve the issue. It comes down to social and political will. So at that moment in 2013, there was, an uproar, I guess, of political and social will, and it resulted in that declaring war on air pollution. It also meant that the government put forward a lot of resources monetarily to do it, and also political will to enforce policies that were quite strict. So moving certain industries outside of cities or placing them strategically where they're not necessarily downwind of the city and a population. It meant closing down certain coal burning factories. It meant pretty stringent policies that they then had enforcement mechanisms to um, uh, see through. And it also meant a huge expansion of their monitoring to make sure this was like what they were doing actually working. It also meant with that monitoring, the data was more open, and so people could actually see what was happening.
Now, measurement and strict enforcement only scale if local officials are rewarded for outcomes. And in my conversation with Professor Lorenzo Trimarchi in episode 8, we looked at how China tied environmental targets to promotion incentives for provincial leaders.
Fundamentally, they have the public officials. They are more like corporate executives with a performance contract, and they all compete in a tournament under which they will be selected for a higher level of power for promotion based on some performance indicator established by the hierarchy. That can be the central hierarchy, can be just a higher political hierarchy and geographical level, but it's really top down. And in the 90s, the priority for the Chinese Communist Party was economic growth, as we know. So the Chinese Communist Party was very focused on growth. Then in the 2000s, I mean, starting already from 2008, we all remember with the Beijing Olympic Games, the pressure that Chinese citizens were made on government to fight pollution. And in the 2010 here, we had this war on pollution declared by the Chinese government, and then environmental standard became more and more important for promotion.
So while the pollution reductions were a success, in episode 9 with him, we also discussed the United States China trade war and the negative impact that had on Chinese policy and air pollution.
And this preliminary evidence, surprising, was pointing at the trade war triggering an increase in pollution in China. What is surprising, because as trade economists, we tend to think about tariff as mainly as a negative income shock, especially for developing countries. So we expect, okay, China is a country heavily specialized in manufacturing. If we give a large trade shock, we expect China to reduce income and therefore to decrease pollution. And that's the prior my co-authors had at the beginning.
But that is not what Lorenzo and his co authors observed. Instead, they dig deeper and they found that the trade war had an impact on policy.
We started to investigate if the trade war had any effect on environmental regulation. And the answer is yes. This is the most robust part of our paper. So environmental regulation seems to be affected by the trade war in a way that the trade war induced an easing in environmental regulation for China. So this is the first big results. The negative shock in trade policy seems to have a negative effect on environmental regulation.
So that policy response to the trade shock highlights how institutions shape outcomes. Now, India operates in a more decentralized system, so states can pilot different instruments. In Gujarat's case, regulators tested a cap and trade market for particulates, using continuous monitoring to turn limits into tradable permits. Here's Dr. Kaushik Depp from episode 7 on how that worked.
In Surat, a vast majority of the pollution problem comes from the textile industry that's there. Surat is very well known for diamonds and jewelry and textiles. These are the two principal industries there. For the textile industry, we created a cap and trade scheme that was to be exercised over about 350 odd industrial units in that one town. But knowing that this is a new solution and this is something that's never been tried anywhere in the world, so the world's first particulate matter market, ladies and gentlemen, was launched and delivered in India and has been functioning for the last 5 years, as I said. to make sure that we were actually designing a solution that's actually real and delivers answers and reduces pollution, we divided this industrial cluster into two groups. So the control group stayed within the existing command and control regime, while the treatment group was put under a cap and trade scheme. The biggest result, I think the biggest result that the regulator was most interested in is that the level of compliance in the market. In the command and control group, the level of compliance was about 64%, which is really what the regulator wanted to solve for. Because in the market, the level of compliance was almost 100%. There was just one compliance period in which two industrial units did not meet their emission targets. And for the regulator, that kind of pretty much solves the entire problem, right? You are able to achieve 100% compliance to an environmental standard that you want to achieve. What do the local people want? They want an improvement in air quality. And for every compliance period, the emission performance of the treatment group, the folks who were there in the market, their emissions were lower by about 20 to 30%. So very significant and a chunky reduction in particulate matter emissions that came from this particular experiment.
Beyond compliance and lower emissions, the adoption question is cost. Do firms have a clear incentive to prefer the market approach? And Kaushik explains the cost side and why participation rose once results were public.
Now, how do we bring industry on board? You and I know this, right? Markets are an efficient tool. The whole point of efficiency is to reduce costs, to improve efficiency. And the folks at the market were able to meet their targets at a cost which was almost 11 to 12% lower than the folks who were there in the command and control regime. So there is a very clear incentive for industry to be in the market, which kind of is also evidence from the fact that once these results came out, all of those folks who were not there in the market, who were in the command and control group, clamor to be included to join the market. And you'd recall the acid rain program from the US. I mean, that had a benefits to cost ratio of about 50 something is to 1. This city of 16 million, with this reduction in emissions, this improvement in compliance cost, this uh, cost of whatever treatment plants, treatment systems that they needed to kind of put in, this cost benefit ratio is well over 200. So I mean, you can imagine the impact that this is having. And all of this took place without a single new dollar or rupee being spent by the Pollution Control Board. So no increase in regulatory capacity.
So we've discussed the results, but what is his main takeaway of this experiment in Surat?
So what this experiment really kind of does prove is that classically what we always think that market-based solutions are so complex, so complicated. How do regulatory environments with limited regulatory capacity deliver these really complicated solutions? What this experiment proves is that these are the right tools to be used with limited regulatory capacity. And these are the right tools that kind of ensure that with limited regulatory capacity, you can achieve the kind of emission performance that you want with lower costs. And lower costs, if you kind of think this through, are essentially an opportunity for industry to grow.
Kaushik is also implementing this vision because setting up a new cap and trade market takes a lot of effort and learning by doing. But now they are taking the lessons from Surat and using it to implement it faster in other states.
So Gujarat was a exercise that Michael and his colleagues started way back in 2008-9. And if I kind of add up every year that kind of went into getting Gujarat up and running, I can kind of easily think that this was an exercise that took about 10 to 15 years. And this exercise took that long because this had never been done before. And every problem as it came up had to be solved. And this kind of ranged from finding the right legal language for the regulation to identify which are the emission monitoring devices that will meet these standards, their installation and calibration protocols, vendors who would make this available, who would be the auditors for this, who would set up the trading platform, the data quality control and quality assurance protocols, everything that came in there. But having done all of that, we are hoping that the second market that we are going to set up now in the state of Maharashtra in India is something that we are able to kind of do it in a period of a year and a half or so. So from 15 years to 18 months is quite a steep improvement. And that's the kind of learning curve that's kind of central to my ambition at Epic. Uh, we talked about this briefly earlier. This is the kind of improvement in solar energy generation costs or wind energy generation costs that we've seen in over the last 15 years. 15 years back, solar used to cost a whole bunch of dollars per megawatt, and now it's down to a few cents. That's the learning curve that I'm attempting to replicate in the design and deployment of these markets. And over time, my ambition is that we have this as a plug and play solution available for jurisdictions around the world, where essentially it's a matter of a few months instead of a few years in terms of designing and implementing a new market. Uh, we are in the process of launching this as a formal initiative, joint initiative of JPAL and EPIC during the New York Climate Week, and we've christened this as the Emissions Market Accelerator.
At the time of this episode, the Emissions Market Accelerator has now been launched, and I encourage you to check it out. But the story does not end there. There is also a mindset shift. Let's end on the following exciting developments that are taking place.
So there's, I mean, so this growth and this expansion that's happening is both intensive and extensive. And let me kind of draw that distinction. Once this experiment in Surat took off and did deliver these results, now the default of the Gujarat Pollution Control Board for every pollution problem is markets. So we are in the process of designing ETS schemes for industrial effluents for them for two central effluent treatment plants. So water pollution is being dealt with in terms of using these markets. They want to explore the use of markets for SO2 as well. And we have a memorandum of understanding with them to think and start developing a carbon market for that state as well. So there is a lot of um, diffusion of the idea that markets can solve environmental problems across the board within that one state. But having seen that success, Maharashtra, the neighboring state, the SO2 market that I talked about, is kind of well underway to use this as a tool and this as a solution to deal with their industrial emissions problems as well. We've just signed a memorandum of understanding with another neighboring state of Gujarat, Rajasthan, to set up a SO2 market for them. This was kind of signed at the last World Environment Day earlier this year. And initial conversations with some other states in India also happening. But if I was to kind of put all of these three states together, uh, if this was kind of one big SO2 trading program, this would be probably the world's largest cap and trade scheme, much bigger than the EU ETS and just in terms of population. This would really be a hugely important and successful result. And seeing this now, there are conversations that we are having with numerous other countries and numerous other geographies and jurisdictions around the world on trying to use cap and trade schemes as solutions to deal with all sorts of environmental problems, including carbon markets. There has been a trend recently, I would say a slightly aggressive trend in the sense of kind of a move away from climate regulation and climate management, especially using economic instruments. But I think once kind of some of these experiments and some of these markets become a lot more viable and grow, it'll become a much more widespread tool. At this point, everyone in our community, in the environmental community, kind of thinks that cap and trade schemes are sophisticated and useful only in very developed jurisdictions like Europe and in a pre-current administration world, US. But what we are doing is showing that this is a tool that's much more widely applicable in the developing world.
So today's best of episode documented one problem, air pollution, across two countries and two designs. China used a command and control framework, paired with clear incentives for local officials, and delivered large, rapid reductions. India has a decentralized approach, where state Gujarat implemented a cap and trade program, achieving high compliance and sizable emission cuts at lower cost. And now there's a diffusion going on to other pollutants and other states. And if I would have to say one thing, it's that the common denominator is measurement. Transparent data initialized the awareness and concern around air pollution in China, helped enforcement, and then also in India, it enabled the market design of cap and trade. Now, we also spent more time on the India cap and trade program, where we went deeper into the cost reductions. And I think it's also a good example generally of why economists prefer cap and trade markets. However, that being said, we did not really go into the numbers of how costly China's command and control framework was, because we didn't really discuss that in that episode in depth. But I do think India's example provides a very strong support for a market approach. This is the end of the episode. I'd like to thank you for listening all the way to the end. And if you have any advice on how to improve the podcast, or advice on future guests or episodes or ideas, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. Have a great day.